England, 1836. A governess arrived late, and nothing in that house would ever be the same again.
The carriage stopped. Stratton Hall was a fortress of grey stone, and Rosalind Hart felt small as she walked toward it. The front door opened before she reached it. The butler looked her up and down, then turned and walked away. A silent order to follow. She walked through a silent hall, past portraits of dead nobles who seemed to stare right through her. "Don't you dare look at me like that," she thought. "I'm not afraid of you." The butler knocked on a study door. A quiet voice said, "Enter." A tall man stood by the window. He turned. This was Duke Stratton. His face was sharp, his expression cold. He looked at her, and Rosalind felt a chill. "You are the governess," he said. "I am Rosalind Hart." He glanced at the clock on the wall, a clear insult about her being late. "My son is spirited. The last 2 tutors were inadequate." He looked her over again. "I trust you will not be inadequate," her mind screamed. "You arrogant, condescending—" Outwardly, she said, "I am very adequate, Your Grace." "We shall see," he murmured, and turned his back on her. Dismissed. Later, in the schoolroom, she met his son. Thomas was a small boy with big, lonely eyes. He looked trapped. Rosalind's heart went out to him immediately. "Okay," she thought, her anger at the Duke hardening into resolve. "I'm staying. For him." That evening, she found Thomas in the library with a book. The Duke appeared in the doorway like a ghost. "This room is forbidden to him," he said. He wasn't looking at his son. He was staring at Rosalind. "Enforce the rules, Miss Hart. That is your only job." Rosalind moved to stand in front of the boy. "He was reading." "He was disobeying," the Duke countered, his voice dangerously low. "He was being a child." She snapped back. The Duke stepped closer until he towered over her. He leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Your job here is conditional, Miss Hart. It depends on you remembering who is master of this house." He straightened up, his cold eyes locking onto hers. "And it is not you." That night, Rosalind paced the threadbare carpet of her small room. "That's it! I am finished," she declared to the empty fireplace, gesturing dramatically. "I will not be spoken to as if I am a disobedient dog. The man is a tyrant, a monster of cold stone." She spun and marched towards the door, hand outstretched to grab the handle. But then, an image of Thomas's small, haunted face flashed in her mind. Her shoulders slumped. She let out a long, defeated sigh. "Oh, confound it all," she whispered to the floorboards. "I cannot leave that boy alone with him." The next day in the schoolroom, Thomas was sullen, pushing a single pea around his lunch plate. The official curriculum called for an hour of dull history. Rosalind looked at the boy's sad face, then at the dreary textbook. She tossed the book aside. "History," she announced, striking a pose, "is not about dates. It is about drama." She leaped onto the small hearth, using it as a stage. She began to recount the tale of a clumsy king who was terrified of spiders, acting out all the parts. She gave the king a squeaky, cowardly voice, and the queen a deep, booming baritone. She scuttled across the floor like a spider, her eyes wide and menacing. At first, Thomas just stared. Then, a tiny smile touched his lips. When she reenacted the king shrieking and fainting into a cake, the boy let out a sudden, beautiful peal of laughter. It was a sound so pure and unexpected, it seemed to shake the dust from the very walls. The laughter faded, and in the quiet that followed, Thomas looked up at her, his eyes shining. My mother. She used to make funny voices like that. The smile was gone, replaced by a profound sadness that made Rosalind's heart ache. There it was, the reason for the Duke's cold, dead house. It wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum of grief. Unseen by either of them, Duke Stratton stood in the shadows of the hallway. He had been walking past and had stopped dead, frozen by a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. He watched Rosalind, a whirlwind of life and color in his grey, silent world. He saw the joy she brought to his son's face, and then the flicker of sadness that followed. A strange, unfamiliar ache tightened in his chest, and he instinctively put a hand to it, leaning against the doorframe for a moment that felt like an eternity. This woman, this governess, she was a dangerous, unpredictable fire, and he felt a terrifying urge to move closer to the flame. He straightened up, his icy mask of control snapping back into place. He could not allow this chaos, this emotion to take root. He stepped into the doorway. The warmth in the room instantly vanished. Thomas flinched. Raslin turned, her smile fading as she saw his cold expression. "An amusing performance, Miss Hart," the Duke said, his voice a low murmur that cut through the air. "But laughter will not teach him Latin. From now on, you will adhere strictly to the approved curriculum." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers, delivering the final chilling blow. "And tomorrow morning, I will be here to observe your methods myself." The next morning, Duke Stratton was a silent statue in the back of the schoolroom. Raslin's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady. She would not be intimidated. She launched into her lesson with a defiant, theatrical flair, teaching Thomas about the constellations by drawing them with grand, sweeping gestures in the air, giving each one a dramatic backstory. She was teaching the boy, but the performance was for the man in the shadows. She could feel his eyes on her, a heavy, burning weight. When she finally dismissed a happy and chattering Thomas for his lunch, the Duke remained. The silence he left in his wake was thick with unspoken words. He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "You are a disruption, Miss Hart," he said, his voice a low, rough thing she had never heard before. "You bring feeling into a house that was settled. Perhaps it was settled into a grave, Your Grace." She countered, her chin high. He took another step, his personal space invading hers. She could smell the scent of old books and winter air that clung to him. "You think you can come in here and fix what is broken?" he murmured, his eyes dark with a tormented emotion. "You know nothing of what is broken. I know a sad little boy who needs his father." The words struck him like a physical blow. He flinched. He took a sharp, unsteady breath and put a hand to his temple, a look of profound pain on his face. He started. Then he swayed. He was falling. Instinct, foolish and immediate, took over. "Your Grace," Raslin cried, lunging forward. She was a woman of 5 feet trying to catch a man of over 6. The attempt was absurd. His weight was too much, and instead of catching him, she was simply pulled down with him. They tumbled to the floor in a chaotic heap of tangled limbs and shocked breaths. He had twisted as they fell, taking the brunt of the impact himself, his body cushioning hers. She landed half on top of him, her hands pressed against the hard wall of his chest. Her face was inches from his, and the mask was gone, utterly gone. The icy control had shattered, and in his eyes she saw a raw, desperate and aching longing that stole the air from her lungs. This was not a sick man. This was a man who was starving. The world narrowed to the space between their lips. It was inevitable. He surged up, closing the final inch, and his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, claiming act, a drowning man's gasp for air. It was warm, and it was consuming, and Raslin felt herself kissing him back, a fire she never knew she had erupting to meet his. The shock of it, the sheer intensity, finally broke through the haze. This was madness. This was her employer. This was the man she hated. Frightened by the kiss, by him, by her own response, she shoved hard against his chest. She scrambled to her feet, her face flushed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Without a word, she turned and fled. She heard him get to his feet behind her. "Raslin!" he called out, his voice a storm of emotion. She didn't stop. She ran down the hall, hearing his heavy, urgent footsteps storming after her. From a nearby doorway, the butler, Lewis, watched with wide, knowing eyes. Raslin reached her room and slammed the door shut, locking it just as his body hit the other side. She leaned against the wood, her heart threatening to beat its way out of her chest. Outside in the hall, the Duke of Stratton stood, breathing heavily. He raised a hand to knock, to demand, to plead, but then he stopped. He looked at his own trembling fingers, and slowly he clenched them into a fist, resting his forehead against the door. "Damn it!" he breathed. "What have I done?" The Duke stood at her door for a long, agonizing moment, his fist still clenched. He could hear the frantic rustle of her movements inside. With a shuddering breath, he forced his hand to lower. He had lost control, a mistake he would not make again. He turned, his face once again a mask of cold, unreadable granite. The butler, Lewis, was pretending to adjust a portrait down the hall, his back ramrod straight. The Duke's gaze swept over him, and the old man simply melted back into the shadows. The master of the house was back in command. Inside her room, Raslin was a storm of panic and fury. She paced the small space, her hands pressed to her still tingling lips. "Madness! Utter madness!" she whispered to the walls. "To kiss him! The brute, the arrogant, maddening, insufferable!" But the memory of the kiss, the raw, desperate heat of it, silenced her tirade. It was a fire she had never known, and it terrified her more than his anger ever had. There was no going back. The line had not just been crossed, it had been incinerated. "I must leave," she said, the words a firm, final vow. "I must." The next morning, she did not go to the schoolroom. She packed her single, small bag, her resolve as hard as a diamond. She would take her final pay, and she would be gone before lunch. Thomas would be heartbroken, and the thought was a knife in her chest, but to stay was impossible. She walked down the main staircase and saw him. He was standing at the bottom, waiting for her. He must have known she would try to flee. He was dressed impeccably, the mask of the cold, untouchable Duke firmly back in place. Only his eyes, dark and intense, betrayed the memory of yesterday. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not slow her pace. She stopped before him, clutching her bag. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and formal. "I have come to tender my resignation." "No," he said simply. The word was not a request. It was a command. Raslin blinked. "I beg your pardon? I will not be accepting it," he stated, his voice a low, even tone that allowed for no argument. What transpired in the schoolroom was a regrettable lapse in judgment. On my part, it will not happen again. A line was crossed, she insisted, her grip tightening on her bag. "My position here is no longer tenable." "I agree." The admission shocked her into silence. She thought for a second that he was letting her go. "Your position as a simple governess is indeed no longer tenable," he continued, his eyes holding hers captive. "Which is why you will no longer be joining me on my walks." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the final, stunning blow. "You will join me for dinner. Tonight. In the main dining hall. As my guest. We have a great many things to discuss." Raslin stood frozen in the grand hall, her packed bag suddenly feeling foolish and heavy in her hand. Dinner? As his guest? The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the man. Her mind raced. He thinks he can command me to stay? After that? That kiss? He is a tyrant. But a second voice, a more curious and dangerous one, whispered back. What does he want? What could he possibly have to say? Her gaze flickered toward the staircase, in the direction of Thomas's room. She couldn't leave the boy. Not yet. She lifted her chin, her decision made. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, her voice cooler than she felt. "I will attend your dinner. I am curious." His expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of relief deep in his eyes. That evening, a nervous energy crackled through the house. The staff whispered as they set the cavernous main dining hall for only two. In her room, Raslin agonized over her wardrobe, which consisted of 3 simple, dark dresses. She chose the least worn one, a deep blue wool that made her feel more like a shadow than a dinner guest. Let him see that I do not belong here, she thought, a spark of defiance hardening her resolve. She entered the dining room to find him waiting, standing by the fireplace. The long table gleamed under the light of a dozen candles, an absurdly formal island in a sea of shadows. He turned as she entered, and his eyes swept over her. She expected a look of disdain for her simple dress, but instead she saw a raw, unguarded admiration that made her breath catch in her throat. The meal was a masterpiece of unspoken tension. They spoke of trivial things, the weather, Thomas's progress in geography, each word carefully chosen, each silence loaded with the memory of the kiss. Finally, Raslin placed her fork down. "Why am I here, Your Grace?" she asked, cutting through the pretense. "This is not about my contract." He met her gaze across the table. "No," he admitted, his voice low. "It is not." He hesitated, a man clearly at war with himself. "What happened in the schoolroom?" "It was a consequence of the disruption you have brought to this house." To me, he looked down at his hands. "I have spent years in a state of quiet control. You have shattered that. I find the silence you leave behind in a room is now more unnerving than the noise you create when you are in it." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. The admission hung between them, fragile and real. He was about to say more, the words gathering on his lips, a confession she felt she had been waiting a lifetime to hear. But at that moment, the dining room doors opened. The butler, Lewis, stood there, his face pale, his posture rigid with distress. In his gloved hand, he held a single letter. "Your Grace, my apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "An urgent delivery has just arrived for Miss Hart." Lewis walked forward and placed the letter on the white tablecloth beside her plate. It was sealed with a single, stark drop of black wax. The black seal seemed to absorb all the candlelight in the room. Raslin stared at it, her blood turning to ice. A black seal meant only one thing. With trembling fingers, she broke it. The Duke watched her, his own half-formed confession forgotten. He saw the color drain from her face as her eyes flew across the page. He saw her sharp intake of breath, the way her body went rigid with shock. A single tear escaped and fell onto the crisp paper, a dark star on the white page. The letter fell from her numb fingers onto the table. "Raslin," the Duke said, his voice quiet and urgent. He had used her first name without thinking. "What is it?" She couldn't speak. She just shook her head, a violent, trembling motion. Pushing her chair back so hard it scraped against the floor, she stood and fled the dining room, leaving the terrible letter behind. The Duke was left alone in the cavernous room, the silence now heavy with her grief. The old Duke Stratton, the man of ice, would have let her go. He would have respected the boundaries, retreated behind his walls, and allowed his governess her private sorrow. But the man who had kissed her in the schoolroom, the man who had just admitted she had shattered his control, could not. He picked up the letter. The words were short and cruel. Her uncle, her last living relative, the man who had raised her, was gone. He walked through the silent halls to the East Wing, a place he had not set foot in since her arrival. He stopped outside her door and heard it. The sound he had banished from his house for years. The sound of raw, unfiltered, heartbreaking grief. She was sobbing, trying and failing to muffle the sound in her pillow. The sound tore through the armor he had spent years building. He understood this pain. He knew this grief. And he knew, with an aching certainty, that no one should have to face it alone. He raised his hand and knocked softly on the door, a hesitant, uncertain sound. There was silence from within. "Raslin," he called through the door, his voice stripped of all its ducal authority, leaving only the raw sound of a man. "Please, let me in." Raslin heard his voice through the wood, and every instinct screamed at her to send him away. She wanted to be alone in her grief, to curl into a ball and let the sorrow consume her. But his voice, it held none of the command or coldness she was used to. It was just the voice of a man, uncertain and stripped of all its armor. Slowly, shakily, she rose from her bed and unlocked the door. He stood in the hallway, looking utterly out of place, his great frame seeming too large for the narrow corridor. He looked awkward, lost, holding a folded white handkerchief in his hand. Her face was a mess of tears. Her hair had come undone, but he didn't flinch. He simply offered her the handkerchief. "You should not be here," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I know," he said. But he did not leave. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, granting her the privacy he knew she needed. And then, the story of her uncle poured out of her. She told him of the man who had raised her, who had taught her to read, who had encouraged her fiery spirit when all others had tried to stamp it out. The Duke did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat in the small, stiff-backed chair in the corner of her room and listened. He gave her the profound gift of his silent, undivided attention. When her words were spent, and only the ragged sobs remained, he did something that shattered the last of her defenses. He moved from the chair and sat on the edge of her bed. Gently, hesitantly, he pulled her into an embrace. It was not a kiss of passion, but a hug of pure, unselfish comfort. She collapsed against his chest, the solid, steady beat of his heart a strange anchor in her storm of grief. For the first time since she'd arrived at Stratton Hall, she felt safe. After a long time, the tears subsided. They sat in a quiet, comfortable silence. The Duke and the governess were gone. In their place were just two people who understood the profound weight of loss. "I lost my wife 4 years ago," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. The silence in the house afterward, "It is the hardest part. I did not want you to be alone with it." The confession was a key, unlocking the last secret part of him. She finally understood the man of ice. He was a man frozen in his own grief. She pulled back, wiping her eyes with his handkerchief. A new strength, born of her sorrow and his shared vulnerability, filled her. "My uncle was a fighter," she said, her voice clear now. "He never surrendered to anything." The Duke looked at her, and his eyes, once so cold, were now filled with a protective fire. He stood, his purpose clear. "Neither will we." He walked to the door, no longer a man lost, but a man with a mission. "My cousin believes me to be a weak, dying man. He has mistaken grief for surrender, and he will pay for that mistake." He turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw the true Duke of Stratton, a powerful, determined man, ready for battle. "Tomorrow we stop defending. Tomorrow we fight back." The next morning, the study was a war room. The curtains were thrown open, flooding the room with light. Raslin and the Duke stood side by side, the two ledgers spread open on the desk. Together, they pieced together the cousin's treachery and crafted the perfect bait. A letter requesting Alistair's presence to finalize the transfer of the estate's management. Alistair arrived precisely at noon, his face a mask of false sympathy, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. He strode into the study, ready to claim his prize. He stopped dead. The Duke was not in a sickbed. He was standing tall and strong behind his desk. Raslin was at his side, her expression like flint. And sitting in a chair by the fire was not a solicitor, but Sir Richard, the stern, unshakable local magistrate. "Cousin," the Duke said, his voice ringing with cold power. "Thank you for coming. We were just reviewing your creative accounting." He slid the hidden ledger across the polished wood of the desk. The magistrate found it particularly compelling. Alistair's face went white. He stammered, he denied, he blustered. But the proof was absolute. His plot crumbled to dust around him. He was ruined. The magistrate stood, his duty clear, and escorted the defeated man from the room and from their lives. The study door closed, and for the first time, the silence in the room was not oppressive. It was peaceful. The Duke turned to her, the weight of years finally lifted from his shoulders. A look of deep regret crossed his face. "I must apologize for the man I was when you first arrived." Raslin looked at him and gave a small, sad smile, her heart filled with a profound understanding. "I was never acquainted with that man," she said softly. "I only knew the prisoner he was forced to be." The truth of her words settled between them, a final, healing balm. He saw in her eyes not just love, but forgiveness. He took both of her hands in his. "I first asked you to be my wife in a moment of chaos, Raslin. I am asking you again now, in the light of a new day." His eyes, so full of warmth and love, held hers. "Be my partner in all things. Fill this quiet, sad house with laughter again. Be my Duchess." "Yes," she said, her voice full of joy. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the schoolroom. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of deep and abiding love, a promise of a future. As they broke apart, they heard the sound of small, running feet. Thomas burst into the room, his face alight with a smile. He ran not to one of them, but to both, and they knelt to wrap him in a shared embrace. The man of ice was gone, and in his place stood a husband and a father. The quiet, cold cage of Stratton Hall was, at long last, a home, and that was the secret. The secret wasn't just a hidden ledger or a cousin's betrayal. It was the truth Raslin had finally uncovered. That the cold, cruel man she thought she hated at first sight was never the real man at all. He was only a prisoner, waiting for someone with the courage to find the key.